"Do not weep, sir. You may have my mama if you wish." The grand ballroom shimmered under the weight of 1,000 golden candles, their flames trembling in the delicate crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations. The polished parquet reflected every flutter of silk and taffeta, and the murmurs of the assembled nobility wove themselves into a soft, yet unforgiving hum of judgment. At the far end, a young woman lingered, her modest gown pale against the opulent richness of the room. She had come with hopes of grace and propriety, yet the society around her seemed determined to strip her of both. Whispers coiled around her like smoke. Who allowed her in? Surely some error of the servants? Can she be of gentle birth? Each voice carried the sharpness of disdain, each glance a blade. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted her gloves, the fabric stretched thin at the seams, and she fought to maintain the posture expected of her, though her heart pounded like a caged bird. Every step toward the dance floor threatened to betray the fragility of her dignity. Across the room, seated beneath the shadowed arches that led into the garden, the Duke watched. Tall, composed, and cloaked in a quiet melancholy, he seemed almost apart from the world, a sentinel to his own solitude. His eyes, dark and contemplative, observed her not with ridicule but with a detached curiosity, as though he were trying to measure the depth of a ripple in otherwise still waters. The Duke's presence was a paradox, both a reminder of the societal walls she could never scale and an unspoken promise that not all eyes carried condemnation. A misstep, a brief stumble on the hem of her gown, sent a ripple of stifled laughter across the room. The noble women exchanged glances that were a mixture of amusement and pity. The heroine's cheeks burned with humiliation, and she pressed her gloved hands to her face, hoping that invisibility might be purchased with silence. But in that moment of despair, a small voice cut through the laughter like sunlight through storm clouds. A child, perhaps no older than 7, tugged at the Duke's sleeve. "Do not weep, sir," he said with the innocence only childhood can muster, his eyes wide and earnest. "You may have my mama if you wish." The room fell briefly silent, not out of reverence but from the sheer audacity of such words. And in that pause the heroine dared to lift her gaze. She caught the Duke's attention fully for the first time, and the moment stretched taut between them, charged with the subtle electricity of unspoken possibilities. The child's offer, so candid, laid bare the stark contrasts of their world. Innocence against cruelty, sincerity against pretense, courage against fear. The Duke's lips curved in a barely perceptible acknowledgement, a flicker of interest that was at once tender and restrained. He did not respond with ridicule, nor did he dismiss the child's boldness. Instead, he remained seated, still and imposing, as if absorbing the weight of her shame and measuring the measure of her spirit. The heroine, her pulse still racing, felt a stirring she had not known before, a fragile hope that perhaps the walls of gossip and judgment could be softened, that some hearts in the gilded cage of society could still recognize authenticity. Yet even as she dared to imagine a sliver of reprieve, the ballroom resumed its symphony of whispered cruelty. Crystal glasses clinked in the hands of those who would have relished her discomfort, and the chandeliers cast long, accusing shadows across her path. It was then that a servant, moving quietly through the room, brushed past her with a note delicately folded, delivered with a soft whisper, "The Duke requests your presence in the garden." Her breath caught between fear and curiosity, for such an invitation was as rare as a comet's passing. The social stakes were immeasurable. A misstep could cement ridicule into reputation. A bold choice could awaken something both dangerous and extraordinary. As she stepped toward the arched doors leading to the garden, the child's eyes followed her, shining with an almost prophetic certainty. And outside, beneath the boughs dusted with winter frost and the quiet silver of moonlight, the Duke awaited. In that moment, the grandeur of the ballroom, the judgments, the whispers, the gilded tyranny of society, faded to nothing. All that remained was the silent promise that even amid shame and scorn, an unexpected, tender defiance could spark the beginning of something irrevocably profound. And so, the first threads of their entwined fates were drawn taut, delicate yet unbreakable, poised on the edge of a world where propriety battled desire and courage battled fear. In the hush of that garden, beneath the winter stars and the shadow of society's scrutiny, the story began, not with grandeur nor with fanfare, but with a child's innocent declaration and the quiet, magnetic pull of two hearts daring to meet. A flower for you, though it be humble, yet it blooms with honesty. The morning following the ballroom humiliation was quiet, almost conspiratorial in its stillness. Winter's breath lingered over the city, frosting the eaves of rooftops and glinting like fractured crystal upon the carriage lamps. The heroine awoke to the weight of yesterday's shame still pressing upon her chest, a tangible burden of whispered mockery and judging eyes. She dressed in the pale light of dawn, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart, her mind a cautious labyrinth of what-ifs and might-bes. A soft rap at the door startled her. A servant, hesitant yet purposeful, offered a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon of muted green silk. There was no signature, only a single note in impeccable script. "For your courage, accept this small token." She untied the ribbon, revealing a simple bloom, its petals a gentle blush of pink, delicate yet striking against the coarse paper. It was modest, humble, but it carried the unmistakable weight of intention. The sender had chosen it with care, and in its quiet elegance lay a language of regard that society itself could not yet comprehend. Curiosity wrestled with trepidation, for she understood all too well the cost of attention from those of higher standing. Her fingers lingered on the petals, and the faint scent stirred a memory of snow-laden gardens, of whispered confidences between strangers, of laughter that dared defy etiquette. It was then she remembered the Duke's eyes from the night before, dark, observant, and unyielding. He had watched, and in that observation there had been no mockery, only recognition. The day's walk through the frost-tipped garden brought another quiet revelation. She had dared to venture outside, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her gloved hands brushing against the brittle branches of trees. There, hidden beneath a bough heavy with frost, she discovered another small gift, a note, delicately pressed between the pages of a forgotten book left on a garden bench. "Courage shines brightest when the world would snuff it out. Your presence is a light I cannot ignore." Society, ever vigilant, was not slow to notice. Rumors began to ripple, subtle at first, like the soft crackle of embers in a dying hearth. The servants whispered, and a passing footman's glance carried more weight than the lady of the manor suspected. "Surely," said one dowager, trailing a lace-gloved finger along her teacup rim, "that flower could mean nothing, yet he has eyes for her, and no one of standing merely watches." The court of public opinion, as merciless as it was swift, set their tongues to sharpened edges. Meanwhile, the Duke maintained his quiet distance, observing her with a deliberate patience that was at once unsettling and magnetic. He did not intrude upon her space openly, but small gestures, an approving nod as she passed a threshold, a discreet delivery of a token meant to buoy her dignity, spoke louder than declarations. Each interaction, each unnoticed act, threaded tension through the delicate lattice of their relationship, like frost creeping over glass. A particularly bold moment arose during the afternoon's tea service in the garden pavilion. The Duke appeared unexpectedly, tall and commanding in a coat of midnight blue, the snow light catching the hard planes of his face. Without preamble, he offered another small gift, a leather-bound journal, unadorned save for the faint impression of a crest. "For your thoughts," he said, voice calm yet vibrating with unspoken meaning. "May they be yours alone, yet may you share them if you wish." The heroine felt a conflation of fear and exhilaration. Acceptance of such attention, however discreet, could ignite social censure. Yet refusal might render her invisible to him forever. She allowed her fingers to brush the leather, feeling the weight not merely of the journal but of his intent. The world around them, the murmurs, the distant snow crunch of servants' boots, the muted laughter of passing aristocrats, receded, leaving only the taut line of unspoken desire stretching between them. The ripple effects were immediate. Later that evening, as the heroine passed along the frost-bitten cobblestones toward her modest lodgings, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. A carriage paused to observe her, the faint glint of candlelight revealing disapproving nods from neighbors and acquaintances alike. The scandal had begun quietly, but it spread like ink on parchment. Yet even as whispers threatened her composure, she carried the Duke's tokens, evidence of a private kindness that defied society's judgment. That night, in the solitude of her chamber, she traced the edges of the journal and inhaled the faint, lingering scent of leather and ink. She imagined the Duke beyond the garden walls, observing, calculating, patient. A surge of emotion, fear, longing, courage, hope, swelled within her. For the first time she realized that scandal and propriety were but two sides of the same coin. Each act of defiance, each small gesture of admiration, carried with it the promise of something extraordinary. And so, the heroine's journey into a world of whispered intrigue and tentative affection began. Every stolen glance, every small token, every hint of scandal wove a pattern of rising tension and unspoken possibility. Society's judgment was relentless, yet the seeds of connection had been sown, delicate yet insistent, awaiting only the right moment to blossom into something far greater than propriety could ever contain. The winter night drew on, frost glinting under the lamplit streets, and in the quiet of her chamber she dared to imagine a glance, a gesture, a note, threads of a romance that might defy the weight of every whisper, every judgment, every societal decree. And somewhere beyond the snow-covered hedges and moonlit gardens, the Duke watched still, patient, knowing that the smallest gestures often spoke louder than the grandest declarations. It is not your circumstance but your courage that renders you remarkable. The carriage wheels crunched against the frost-hardened gravel as the heroine was escorted to the estate's secluded library, a place seldom visited by anyone other than the Duke himself. The winter dusk pressed against the tall windows, painting the room in a muted palette of gray and silver. Inside, the warm glow of the hearth flickered across the dark oak shelves, casting shadows that danced in rhythm with the flames, and the scent of aged leather and beeswax permeated the air. Every inch of the space spoke of quiet authority, of knowledge preserved and guarded, much like the man who waited within it. The Duke rose as she entered, his presence commanding yet measured, the intensity in his eyes tempered by a restraint born of years spent mastering both society and self. He did not close the door behind her. He allowed the chill of the winter evening to mingle briefly with the warmth of the room, a subtle reminder that their meeting existed between two worlds, the constraining, judgmental exterior of society and this intimate, unguarded sanctuary. "You need not fear," he said, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to command yet softened by an unspoken vulnerability. "I did not summon you to admonish, nor to offer empty pleasantries. I wished only for your company if you will permit it." She curtsied, though her heart fluttered as if in rebellion. Sir, I am grateful for your invitation, though I fear my presence may be more a curiosity than a courtesy." He allowed himself the faintest smile, a subtle curve that hinted at amusement and something far deeper, something restrained yet undeniable. "Curiosity often opens the door to understanding," he replied, stepping closer to the hearth. The firelight kissed the contours of his face, revealing not merely the sharp elegance of his features, but the trace of loneliness that no crowd could dispel. "And understanding is seldom given freely in this world. Yet I find it necessary here with you." The heroine's breath caught, a mix of anticipation and caution, for she understood the stakes of proximity to one so esteemed. Yet she dared to lift her gaze, meeting his without falter. "And what understanding do you seek of me, sir?" "Not of you alone," he said, crossing the polished floor with a measured grace, "but of what courage looks like in the midst of 1,000 whispers. You possess a dignity," his tone softened, almost reverent, "that defies circumstance. That, in truth, compels admiration even from the coldest observers." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. She had spent her life learning the delicate art of invisibility, of bending without breaking, of remaining small to avoid scrutiny. And yet, in the stillness of this library, in the presence of a man who wielded both power and discretion, she felt something forbidden, the stirring of recognition, the sensation of being seen for herself rather than the station, or lack thereof, from which she came. "I have never claimed courage, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of both fear and pride. "I have only endured what is set before me as best I may. The world is merciless to those it deems unworthy. My heart is cautious for good reason. And yet it beats with a quiet fortitude," he countered, stepping closer, the warmth of the fire casting fleeting golden highlights across his coat. "I have observed it, each glance in the ballroom, each measured step, each act of composure under scrutiny. Do not mistake my silence for indifference. There are things society cannot measure nor restrain. You, madam, are such a thing." The intimacy of his words, delivered in the hushed, private cadence of a man accustomed to control, left her breathless. She dared to ask the question that had lingered unspoken since the evening of her humiliation. "And you, what do you see in me, sir? Is it merely the defiance of society's cruel gaze?" He paused, gaze lingering, fingers brushing absent-mindedly against the spine of a leather-bound tome. "I see the essence that flourishes despite judgment," he confessed. "I see a heart that does not bend entirely to fear, a mind that reasons with clarity, a spirit that persists when the world whispers that it should vanish. It is not your station I admire, nor your appearance, nor the circumstance that places you here among us. It is you, unveiled, unguarded, human." The heroine's chest tightened, a mixture of hope and terror rising like the swell of winter wind beyond the windows. She had been taught to measure worth by reputation and wealth, to fear the weight of nobility and the cruelty it could wield. And yet here, in the quiet of the Duke's sanctuary, she felt herself considered, understood, acknowledged, not as a subject of gossip, but as a person of substance. A silence followed, neither intrusive nor empty, but full of unspoken possibilities. The crackle of the hearth seemed to echo the beating of two hearts learning to measure each other's tempo. Then, almost imperceptibly, he added, "I am constrained by my title, by expectation, by the world beyond these walls. Yet in moments such as these I am free to speak truth, and I must, for fear that in silence I would lose what is most precious, understanding you." Tears, unbidden and quiet, pooled in her eyes. She bowed her head, the flutter of her lashes trembling against her cheeks. "Sir, you need not speak further," he interrupted gently, the slightest incline of his head granting permission to her unguarded emotion. "I require only that you know, your presence is of consequence to me, though I would ask nothing of you you are not ready to give." The heroine lifted her eyes once more, emboldened by his restraint, yet acutely aware of the delicate precipice upon which they both balanced. A moment of confession, tender and fragile, yet filled with the tremulous promise of something neither dared declare aloud in the world beyond the library. And so, in the quiet flicker of firelight, amid the solemnity of aged tomes and winter shadows, they reached the turning point of their entwined journey. The Duke had spoken truth without coercion. The heroine had received it with a mixture of awe and fear. Between them, a current thrummed with potential, the first undeniable thread of intimacy, binding two souls in a space where propriety dared not intrude, yet society waited impatiently beyond the walls to judge, to whisper, and to challenge the fragile bloom of connection that had begun to take root. "I have waited for a heart that beats with such quiet courage. It is yours entirely." The grand hall shimmered under the crystalline brilliance of 1,000 chandeliers, each flame catching the glint of polished parquet and gilded accents, casting elongated shadows that seemed to watch the scene unfold with silent judgment. Tonight, the air was taut with anticipation. Every whisper, every rustle of silk, carried the weight of expectation, and the assembly of nobility had come prepared to witness propriety in its most stringent form. Yet the Duke, tall and commanding, appeared not merely as a figure of authority but as a storm contained in tailored midnight blue, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with measured intent, seeking her among the tapestry of silks and lace. The heroine, her modest gown now transformed by careful tailoring and subtle elegance, stepped into the room with a quiet resolve. She moved with grace, her shoulders squared against the scrutiny of aristocratic eyes, her heart a drumbeat of equal parts dread and hope. Society's murmurs trailed behind her, some tinged with suspicion, others with admiration, as though the collective breath of the hall awaited the first strike of the narrative yet to come. The Duke approached, his stride deliberate, each step a statement of authority and intent. When he reached her, the room seemed to contract, every whisper stilled by the gravity of their presence together. He offered his hand, and in the gesture lay an undeniable declaration, not merely of courtship, but of defiance against the rigid strictures of society. "You have endured with a fortitude that astonishes me," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the immediate hush. "It is not merely courage I admire, but the grace with which you wield it, even under the weight of scorn and rumor. I have observed, I have waited, and I must speak what I can no longer contain. Your heart is mine to cherish should you allow it." Her breath caught, for the magnitude of his words struck her not only with surprise but with profound validation. She had navigated the cruel currents of society for so long, only to find in this singular declaration that courage and dignity were visible, recognizable, and, most astonishingly, valued. The assembly stirred, whispers rising like a tide, yet the heroine's eyes did not waver. "Sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it, "I have never sought recognition, yet I have yearned to be seen. If my heart is to be offered, it shall be freely, for I fear nothing but the loss of integrity in the act." A ripple of astonishment coursed through the hall. Nobles who had once whispered mockery now bore witness to an exchange that defied expectation. The Duke's lips curved into a measured, approving smile, a mixture of triumph and tender admiration. "Then it is freely received and with all that I possess," he said, his voice softening yet resonant, carrying the weight of sincerity. "Together, we shall navigate the world's judgment, for what is propriety against the truth of hearts aligned?" The heroine allowed herself a small yet deliberate gesture of trust, her hand finding his, a brief but electric touch that conveyed both submission and strength. In that contact lay the culmination of whispered tokens, stolen glances, and quiet confessions. The private had become public, and the unspoken had taken form. The child who had first bridged their worlds appeared at the edge of the hall, eyes wide and gleaming with triumph, a gentle smile acknowledging the completion of a silent orchestration. "I knew it," the child whispered, barely audible above the rustle of fabrics, "that hearts such as yours could not remain unseen." The room seemed to pulse in response, society's scrutiny momentarily eclipsed by the undeniable authenticity of the moment. The Duke bowed slightly, a gesture of both elegance and dominance, and inclining his head toward the heroine, spoke again, "Let it be known that we step forward not in defiance nor in rebellion, but in the quiet authority of mutual regard. All who witness are invited to see that love, tempered by respect and courage, requires no permission beyond its own conviction." The heroine's eyes glistened, a mingling of relief and joy, for the burden of invisibility, the suffocating pressure of whispered judgment, had been lifted by this singular act of honesty. No longer would she tread lightly through the corridors of society, her presence minimized to avoid ridicule. She had been seen, acknowledged, and chosen. And in that choice lay the resolution of every tension that had preceded it. The Duke's authority and isolation balanced against her vulnerability and quiet strength. The rigid gaze of society softened by the irrefutable force of authenticity. The past humiliation transformed into the triumphant assertion of dignity and heart. The room, still, seemed to exhale as they stood together, hands entwined, a living testament to the power of courage meeting recognition. In the charged silence, whispers of approval began to replace those of scorn, admiration brushing lightly against lingering prejudice, and for a moment, the world outside their connection, its rigid rules, its shallow judgments, fell away. It was not merely a declaration of affection, but a reclamation of selfhood, a triumph over fear, and a signal that the delicate, patient weaving of hearts and intentions could withstand even the sharpest scrutiny. The climax, though public, carried the intimacy of all that had passed in secret. Stolen glances, whispered reassurances, and tokens that had spoken more eloquently than words. As the chandeliers flickered and the winter moonlight filtered through the arched windows, the Duke and the heroine shared a glance that spoke volumes, a promise of devotion forged in the crucible of societal expectation and personal courage. And though the hall remained populated by the curious and the judgmental, their world had contracted to this single, perfect axis, the meeting of hearts unafraid at last to claim one another. Perhaps it was a child who first understood what we dared not speak. The frost-laden garden shimmered beneath the moon's pale gaze, each branch etched in silver, each pathway glinting with frozen dew. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of burning hearths from nearby windows, mingled with the delicate aroma of winter blooms that persisted stubbornly against the cold. Here, removed from the rigid scrutiny of the ballroom and the whispered judgments of society, the Duke and the heroine walked side by side, their steps slow, deliberate, as though measured to the rhythm of a shared understanding. The child who had first bridged their worlds ran ahead, laughter spilling like a bright bell through the quiet, scattering the last vestiges of tension that clung to the garden. The heroine watched with softened eyes, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. 4 months she had navigated fear, shame, and uncertainty, yet now in this private, luminous world, all burdens seemed suspended. The Duke, ever vigilant, noted the curve of her hand in the moonlight, the careful strength in her carriage, and felt the swell of a long-contained tenderness rise without restraint. He stopped beneath an arched trellis, frost glinting on ivy that clung like delicate lace. Turning to her, he reached for her hand, their fingers entwining in a touch both possessive and reverent. "I have watched," he began, voice low and steady, "as the world sought to diminish you. I have seen the weight of whispers, the sting of eyes that cannot fathom virtue unadorned by wealth or title. And yet, through it all, you endured, not as one diminished but as one who commands her own dignity. It is in that courage, in that unyielding grace, that I have found my home." Her breath caught, a tremor of emotion that neither shock nor joy could fully contain. She raised her eyes, meeting his with a courage born of trial and tempered by longing. "Sir," she whispered, "I have feared the world, yet you have shown me that even in its shadow there can be light." She paused, the enormity of the moment pressing upon her, then spoke with quiet certainty, "I give you my heart freely because I have learned that some truths must not be hidden, that love, when genuine, cannot be restrained." A hush fell over the garden, as though nature itself had leaned closer to witness this moment. The frost seemed to glimmer more brightly, the child's laughter softened to a distant echo, and even the moon seemed to hold its breath. The Duke lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss that was neither hasty nor ornamental, but solemn and deliberate, a pledge made in the language of both restraint and unbridled sincerity. "Then it is yours entirely," he said, his gaze unwavering, "and I shall defend it with every measure I possess." The heroine's chest swelled with relief and joy, yet beneath the elation lingered a tremor of vulnerability, memory of past humiliation, of whispered slights, of society's ever-watchful eyes. She sensed, however, that this declaration was not merely a triumph over circumstance, but a transformation of her own understanding of worth and love. She was no longer merely the subject of observation, she was the arbiter of her own heart. The child bounded back into view, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. "See!" the young voice cried, exuberant and triumphant. "I knew it. You belong together, and now the world must see it too." The simplicity of the remark pierced deeper than any formal declaration could, for it reminded them both that innocence often perceives what propriety cannot. The Duke's lips twitched in a rare, unguarded smile, and the heroine laughed softly, the sound a melody of relief and unspoken promise. Together they walked the winding paths of the garden, hand in hand, exchanging quiet words that carried the weight of months of restraint, observation, and longing. The Duke spoke of protections, of futures, and of society's judgments softened by truth. The heroine offered trust, courage, and a warmth that had been carefully guarded until now. Each step, each whispered word, each glance was both a reclamation and a pledge, binding them in a way that societal titles could not disrupt and gossip could not undo. As the first light of dawn began to pale the night sky, they paused beneath a frost-dusted arch. He drew her close, forehead to forehead, voice a whisper meant only for her ears. "In your courage I have found my solace, in your love my home." She rested her cheek against his, her breath mingling with his, a quiet echo of the warmth that had grown between them. "And I in yours," she whispered, "for it is not merely your protection I seek, but your understanding, your presence, and your heart." A gentle wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of early blooms, the whisper of distant chimneys, and the quiet hum of a world resuming around them. Society's gaze, though still vigilant beyond the hedges, could no longer dictate the terms of their union. The tokens of scandal, of whispered intrigue, of shy glances and secret notes, had culminated in this singular, undeniable truth. Love, founded upon courage and mutual regard, transcends the rigid strictures of etiquette and reputation. And so, beneath the frost-kissed arches and the pale gaze of the moon, their story reached its final crescendo, not with fanfare nor with spectacle, but with a quiet, inexorable certainty. Two hearts, tempered by trial and trialed by the world, now beat in unison, defying whispers, defying expectation, and thriving in the luminous clarity of shared devotion. "In your courage I have found my solace, in your love, my home." The words lingered in the night air, a promise as enduring as the frost, as radiant as the first morning light, and as unassailable as the quiet triumph of hearts that have dared to meet and claim one another at last.